think China will protect Hong Kong, but China can't protect Hong Kong if a country like France decides to put Hong Kong on its French blacklist and deny French taxpayers deductions for payments to Hong Kong companies.
Which, as I understand, that we were on the Italian blacklist, several years ago. But having said that, is that there is a reality that, that certainly in the economic sphere, the mainland have been very, very good to Hong Kong. And the double tax agreement that we had with mainland, certainly from my perspective, came as a surprise and a very, very welcome surprise.
Right. Okay, let's turn to the Board of Review. You were a deputy chairman for many years. There has been some discussion kicked off by the Court of Final Appeal with their comments in a couple of cases, at least one big case, the ING Bearings case, that the Board of Review should be reformed, should perhaps have a specialist panel, perhaps have full-time judges. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that they're all very valid criticisms, and certainly in terms of Bearing, that was more than justified. The Board really struggled in that case, perhaps for understandable reasons, but they did struggle, and the end result was perhaps unacceptable. But my own view is that yes, it would be wonderful to have a specialist tax court, as you do in the United States, within the structure, within a reform structure of the board, a legislative structure of a tax court. But I think the figures show of the number of appeals that are outstanding and don't justify or don't appear to justify a full-time tax tribunal. But however, within the existing framework of the Board of Review, I think a formal cohort of board members and deputy chairmen, one or two deputy chairmen, who specialise in complex cases is desirable, and indeed it's necessary. And I'd like the board also, in their cases, to refer more to precedent, with their own precedent. I realise that they're not bound by another board's decision, and clearly facts of different board cases can be quite different. But I think it is disconcerting to certainly to the tax advisors and also to the tax-paying public that you see different decisions of the board that don't seem to refer to contrary precedent. I feel that's unsatisfactory. And I think a specialist tribunal would help that situation and would help it greatly.
Well, were there any particularly interesting board cases that come to mind when you think about your days as chairman?
Yes, I felt that in my role as deputy chairman, one was to get the parties, and I must say typically it would have to be the taxpayer, but not solely or necessarily so, to understand the position of the other side. And I often found the case that at a board hearing was the first time that the taxpayer really understood what the revenue was on about, if I can use the vernacular. And I used that opportunity to try to educate, as I say, both the taxpayer and also the revenue, where I could, for them to understand one another's position. And I must say that in many cases I got quite a few withdrawals from taxpayers and settlements. And I felt as though, even though the taxpayer and sometimes the revenue may not have been satisfied with the ultimate decision, totally satisfied, and nonetheless it was an educative process. And I think that's one of the real, I'd like to think it's one of the real successes and strengths of the Board of Review system. Secondly, I think this demonstrates a weakness, and you'd appreciate, Jeff, it was in the source of profits disputes. Often unrepresented taxpayers or underrepresented taxpayers really struggled in source of profits and also source of employment income disputes, although then it tended, in those cases, the latter, it tended to be a little bit more clear. But where source is a hard, practical matter of fact, and yet the documents, or some documents, tend to show a different story, unless the taxpayer is very well prepared and well briefed, it's very difficult to overcome that evidential burden which some of the documents show. And I really, and without going into specifics, because of the confidentiality involved, I must say I felt sorry for some of the appellants that came before me, because their case just wasn't really presented in the best possible light. Third, I think the most interesting case that I ever did was where a gentleman who was married in a civil marriage to another man, which was legal in Canada, claimed married person's allowance, and I called together the parties in a pre-board hearing, and I mentioned to him that whatever my decision would be, if it was for him, then I would feel 99.9% sure that the revenue would appeal, and if it was against him, then maybe a better venue for that decision would be the court. And of course, any court hearing would be it's open, of course, and not confidential at all. And after taking those not those views into account, but understanding the costs involved in court hearing and the publicity that may be involved, he withdrew. But the case was a very, very interesting one to see in order to determine whether he would have claimed a married person's allowance. And I must say that now I'm not on the board, I had a lot of sympathy for that argument. Well, perhaps not just from the wording of the ordinance itself, but from a human rights basic law perspective.
Now, you've taken up residence in Australia, your home country, where I guess you were first involved in tax law.
Yes.
They have a very much more complicated system, much more like Canada or the US. And you're spending some time with ATAX at University of New South Wales.
I am. I'm teaching at least half a course in comparative Asian taxation at ATAX next semester.
Okay. Any feeling about whether it's better to get more and more complex in an effort to get more and more perfect, or to keep it simple, as you've talked about the virtues of stability and simplicity in the Hong Kong system, and at the expense of some rough edges on the application of the law?
Well, it was nearly one of those, the Peter Sellers moment in Dr. Strangelove, when I had to tick the box when I came back to Australia last time, for the first time in nearly 30 years, which was Australian citizen returning home. And it's proved to be right. I think in Hong Kong, strangely enough, for tax specialists such as ourselves, on a personal matter, maybe I thought about taxation about 10 minutes a year. That was when I was filling out my own tax return. And I had a small business as well, and it was very easy to comply with. I won't say my life in Australia is governed by taxation, but I think about it all the time. Clearly, though, that the revenue needs of a government such as the Australian one and versus the Hong Kong one in terms of social security and what advantages are given to the citizens there are very different. But there must be a middle road. The Australian system, for a country as small as it is, with a huge amount of legislation, rulings, practices, and so many people have tax agents, you know inherently there is something wrong with it.
Okay, well, I think that's pretty much uses up our time.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts on Hong Kong, China, the region before we close?
I miss Hong Kong hugely.
Okay, well, thanks very much for being with us. And thank you, the viewing public. We'll be back soon with another edition of the International Tax Post video segment.